All right. What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is January 6th, 2025, and it's about 9:05 p.m. where I'm at right now. And we are continuing our reading of our 8th book in our Book to React series. This is part 2 of White Women, Black Men, Illicit Sex in 19th Century Southern America, written by Martha Hodes. You can find this book on Amazon, which was published, I believe, in 1997, but they have it listed here as 1999 for the humble price of only $24.08. And yeah, I already read the biography of Martha Hodes, and we already read part 1 where she talks about how she put together this book, how she got the information. Basically, all of the information will come from legal documents of court cases, essentially of people who were charged with crimes of fornication, adultery, bastardy, things like that. And yeah, she actually had to sort of like reconstruct these stories by filling in some gaps in the narrative. But essentially, all of this is true information that comes from a storied historian that did her research and earned her PhD thesis from Princeton on this topic. So without further ado, let's jump into chapter 2 of this very fascinating book. We'll only read chapter 2 today, and then chapter 3 will be tomorrow. Jump into the comments. I will be reading all the comments from anybody who has anything to say about this topic, and we will be covering the story. So let's continue here. Chapter 2, Marriage, Nell Butler and Charles. Because marriage between blacks and whites was prohibited for because marriage between blacks and whites was prohibited or severely discouraged by law in the 19th century American South, sexual liaisons between white women and black men took the legal form of fornication or adultery. That had not been the case from the beginning of English settlement in these southern colonies. For there was a time before the entrenchment of racial slavery when relationships between white women and black men could have the sanction of law. In 1681, a white servant named Eleanor Butler, called Irish Nell, and a black slave called Negro Charles married on the lower western shore of Maryland. The earliest mixing of Europeans and Africans in North America took place in the Chesapeake, the site of the first permanent English colonies across the Atlantic and the first in which the colonists wrote slavery into their laws. Because this story spans the 17th and 18th centuries, it serves well as a prologue to an investigation of sexual liaisons between white women and black men in the 19th century South. I just want to say something before we jump in. This book was written before the inauguration of President Barack Obama, and I've heard that Barack Obama has lineage through his mother's side to Eleanor Butler. And if it's not Eleanor Butler, then it is another white woman who married a black man in the late or mid 17th century. So don't quote me on that, but look that up yourself. I've heard this. So if there is an argument to be made that Barack Obama is FBA, it's actually through his mother's lineage, that his mother has lineage to a white woman who married a black man and had children many, many, many centuries ago. But look that up yourself. So the marriage of Nell Butler and Charles in the late 17th century Chesapeake was much discussed by the couple's elite white neighbors. Yet that discussion was most emphatically not about Charles's transgression with a white woman. Only after the Civil War would whites' ideas about the dangers of black male sexuality merge with their fears of political and economic independence for African American men to produce a deadly combination. That was not at all the case for this servant woman and slave man in the colonial Chesapeake. The consternation of local white people at the marriage of Nell and Charles centered on the consequences of the match. Why, they wondered, would a white woman marry a black man when the law stipulated that a white woman and all her children would become slaves by virtue of that marriage? Indeed, those circumstances were exactly what propelled the case into court nearly a century later. When Nell and Charles married in 1681, no court case resulted. The story came to be told only in the following century, when two enslaved grandchildren of Nell and Charles filed a petition claiming their freedom on the grounds of descent from a free white woman. The story of Nell and Charles was then recounted by 16 white witnesses, a fairly well-to-do group of neighbors. These witnesses were descendants of the white neighbors of Nell and Charles, and their knowledge of the unusual marriage was conjured up in the 1760s to resolve the legal status of the grandchildren. In order to reach a verdict, the court had to determine the legal status of Nell Butler after her marriage to Charles. The sentiments of the colonial white neighbors, as refracted through the recollections of their descendants, illuminate connections between the development of racial slavery and the problem of sexual liaisons between white women and black men. The marriage of Nell and Charles would ultimately cross boundaries not only of the categories of English and African, but also of the categories of whites and black, free and enslaved. Ozzy says, salute Simon, ready to learn. Shout out to Ozzy as well for joining into the chat. Basically, if you're joining late, Martha Hodes is setting up this story that she's going to tell about Nell, who was a white woman back in the mid to late 17th century, who married a black man. And this was during the colonial American time before, the laws were so rigid about slavery, who was enslaved, because the law saying that only black people could be enslaved was not even like, a part of the fabric yet. And so they were still putting together the laws of, the rigid racial hierarchy that would be America. Right. And so Nell and Charles fell in love and they got married. Continuing here. So, consequences of the wedding. Here is the story of Irish Nell and Negro Charles as recounted by the 18th century witnesses. Charles was a slave on the plantation of Major William Boorman. In 1681, when Nell Butler arrived in Maryland as the servant of the 3rd Lord Baltimore, Baltimore boarded at Boorman's plantation. At the Boormans, Nell washed, ironed, cooked, spun, labored in the fields, and performed the service of a midwife. After a short while, William Boorman purchased Nell's services from Lord Baltimore. Nell and Charles were to be married, but not because the servant woman had a verbal spar with the Lord. On the morning of the wedding, on the morning of the wedding day, Baltimore, who had been informed of the impending marriage, cautioned Nell against it, telling her that by such an act she would make slaves of herself and her descendants. Nell cried and told Lord Baltimore not only that this was her choice, but also that she would rather marry Charles than marry Baltimore himself, and that she would rather go to bed with Charles than with Lord Baltimore. Unable to persuade her to change her mind, Baltimore cursed Nell and dismissed her. Very interesting. So this, white woman who basically came as like an indentured servant had the opportunity to marry a very wealthy white man and instead fell in love with the black slave guy. His name was Charles. And she said, I'd rather marry slave Charles and have my children become slaves than rather marry you, Lord Baltimore, which is wild, Most people would not make that choice. But continuing here. So the wedding ceremony was performed by a local Catholic priest at the Boorman plantation in the summer of 1681. Nell behaved as a bride, and several people wished the couple much joy. A little white boy was urged to kiss the bride, or she wanted to kiss him, or did kiss him, and he ran away. Old Madam Witham, old Mrs. Doyne, old Ann Short, and old Mrs. Ruthhorn were all there. Someone said it was a fine wedding. Afterward, Nell and Charles acknowledged themselves as man and wife, and people knew them as such. Nell called Charles her old man, and Charles called Nell his old woman. When William Boorman died in 1709, his wife, Mary, married John Sanders, and Nell and Charles went to the Sanders household. Nell also lived and worked for some time at the household of Leonard Brooke, who married one of the Boorman daughters. Nell and Charles had 3 or 4 children, all of whom were enslaved from birth. These children either lived at the Boorman plantation or were hired out or sold to other families. When Nell died, she was much broken and an old woman. Very interesting. Ozzy says she was an immigrant from Ireland. It sounds like it. I mean, Nell Butler arrived in Maryland as a servant of the 3rd Lord Baltimore. I guess maybe she was from Ireland. It doesn't exactly say. I don't remember if they said so either, but essentially she was a white woman who went into slavery with her husband, had 3 or 4 kids with him. All of their kids went into slavery as well. Her husband died before she did, and then she was, very sad and lonely. Okay. So it is instructive to compare the marriage of Nell and Charles to liaisons between white women and black men that later came to pass in the antebellum South. Later liaisons would lack public ceremony and operate under at least a pretense of secrecy. In conjunction with those restraints, however, antebellum white neighbors could respond to such liaisons in ways that were not so very different from the response of the white neighbors of Nell and Charles. This included expressions of apprehension at the liaison, pronouncements of judgment against the white woman, and the absence of violent retribution against the black man. Of course, there were other liaisons between white women and black men in the colonial Chesapeake in which the participants did try for secrecy, notably those that took place outside of marriage, and these outnumber the incidences of matrimony. But the wedding of Nell and Charles is evidence of leeway for a union within the lowest rank of society that was legally sanctioned by those in the highest. The marriage of Nell and Charles was a transgression, but not an illicit one. The well-to-do white neighbors who watched Nell and Charles marry held more than enough social authority to take local matters into their own hands had they wished to. The masters of Nell and Charles were captains, commanders, and merchants in Maryland's Catholic community. This was a community that relied on informal networks of friends and neighbors in the absence of extensive kin relations. Laws were enforced by county courts and magistrates. Those citizens considered themselves responsible for the social order by keeping watchful eyes over neighbors and by seeing to the punishment of transgressors. These masters and their social equals did not fervently condemn Nell and Charles. Far from it. They attended the wedding, even as they judged Nell for her actions. The guests seemed to have been drawn from the inner circle of white families that included the Bormans and the subsequent masters of Nell and Charles. Unfortunately, the documents contain almost no information whatsoever about the responses of less well-to-do white people or of neighboring servants and slaves. So essentially what she's trying to say here is that Nell, this poor white woman who was an indentured servant, married this black slave, and her master and many of the other rich, powerful white folks who were around could have had the opportunity to stop it. Basically, at that time, the rich folks were the law. And the rich folks could basically take this woman to court, separate this marriage, kill Charles, whatever they wanted to do, right? And they would have gotten away with it, but they didn't, because that goes to show at the time that this marriage took place, the laws weren't so strict and rigid about who could marry who and what was what. Now, I said earlier that the laws weren't so rigid about only black people could be slaves. I was wrong. Any woman who gave birth to a black person, and in this case, Charles marries Nell, and Nell gives birth to a black baby, biracial baby, that baby is going to be black, and that baby will be a slave. That's how the law was at the time. And so they were telling Nell, hey, don't do this. Don't do this. Continuing here. In certain ways, then, the marriage of this white woman and this black man in 1681 was not a cause for tremendous concern among those who held authority on Maryland's lower western shore. Several factors explain this relative equanimity: the blurred lines among classes of bound laborers, the probability of some acquaintances with other liaisons between white women and black men, and the absence of severe and violent white alarm over sex between white women and black men in the late 17th century. First, Nell and Charles had married in a society that did not distinguish a great deal between the conditions of servitude and slavery. Although the small number of Africans imported into the Chesapeake in the early 17th century may or may not have been slaves on arrival, they could be treated by their English masters in ways that differed little from the treatment of unfree English laborers. Living and working conditions on Maryland's lower western shore varied less between servants and slaves than among different households, and masters did not always perceive a great distinction in the respective situations of servants and slaves. As a male slave, Charles would have worked in the fields cultivating tobacco. Female servants like Nell performed domestic labor but masters did not keep them out of the fields, and Nell worked in both places. One witness, for example, recalled that Nell was a hard laboring body and made good crops. Charles's voice, except for calling Nell his old woman, does not come through at all in the sources, but it is unlikely that from his point of view, marriage to a white woman made some sense. Among blacks, as among whites, women were in short supply, and whereas white men who had finished their terms of servitude were free to move about in search of brides, enslaved men found no such freedom. Moreover, black women's chances of ill health and death, and their possible unwillingness to bring children into a world of enslavement and hard labor, made marriage to them more difficult. So basically, what she's trying to say here is like, at this time, if you were a white woman or a white man indentured to servitude to some rich white man, it's no different than if you were a slave. Now, I have some issue with that because that makes a lot of white folks say, hey, my family came in 1799 and we were indentured servants and it was no different than slavery. No, it was different because, as Martha Hodes says here, white men who were free from indentured servitude after a certain number of years could go out and do whatever they wanted. Black men didn't have that opportunity, and a lot of white women didn't have that opportunity either. So no, it's not exactly the same. Slave didn't have that many options, especially since a lot of women were dying at the time, and there were so few women in the early colonial America. Continuing here. Second, the liaison between Nell and Charles was not a complete anomaly, precisely because the lives of white and black laborers could be so closely intertwined in the colonial Chesapeake. The existence of other liaisons between white women and black men helps to explain the forbearance of white people, while at the same time, those liaisons can be understood as a consequence of that forbearance. Other freedom suits on the western shore of Maryland, like the one brought by the descendants of Nell and Charles, attest to other marriages between white women and black men. A man named Basil Shorter, for example, won his freedom by proving that he was the great grandson of a white woman and a black man, both of whom served the same master. Shorter produced a document stating that in 1681, the same year in which Nell and Charles married, a priest did join together in the holy estate of matrimony a Negro man named Little Robin to a white woman whose name was Elizabeth Shorter. Likewise, in another freedom suit, Louis Mingo proved he had been born in 1682, the son of a white woman and a black man. Mingo's parents had been lawfully married according to the rite and ceremonies of the Church of England, and a freedom suit in 1715 proved that a woman named Rose was the baptized daughter of a white woman named Mary Davis, who had been married to a black man named Domingo. Colonial Chesapeake marriages between white women and black men were also recorded in other kinds of documents. The marriage of a white servant woman and a black man was noted in an inventory of 1713 that listed one Irish woman named Grace married to a Negro man, as well as two mulatto children born since their marriage. In a 1720 advertisement for a runaway slave, the owner described a male fugitive as in company with a white woman named Mary. Hoot is supposed now goes for his wife. I've never heard the word hoot. Hoot is supposed to now go for his wife. Colonial marriages between white women and black men could also, however, be scrutinized by the courts, especially in the 18th century. In 1735, a mulatto man named Joseph Guy and a white woman named Bridget were convicted on the eastern shore of Maryland for marrying contrary to the Act of Assembly. Both were sold to a master, presumably as slave and servant, respectively. And in 1742, the white Elizabeth Pearl was brought to court on the western shore for marrying a mulatto, Daniel Pearl. Other freedom suits attest to liaisons between white women and black men without the benefit of marriage. Most such cases entered the historical record as unadorned accounts of evidence proffered and freedom granted. For example, a slave named Jonathan Glover petitioned for liberty when in his 20s, swearing in county court that he had been born in 1680 to a white woman named Sarah Smith, who was not married to the petitioner's black father. fornication, and bastardy charges in the court records of the colonial Chesapeake likewise attest to liaisons between white women and black men without the sanction of law. At least until the 1660s, illicit liaisons between English and Africans had been treated not unlike illicit liaisons between two English people. Penalties were intended to control reproduction among unmarried white women. Pregnancy and childbirth interfered with women's labor, and patriarchs regulated reproduction, whether the fathers were black or white. In most such cases, the transgressing white woman was sentenced to become a servant. If she was already an indentured servant, her term would be increased to make up for the lost work time during pregnancy and childbirth. In addition, the illegitimate children of white women and black men were sentenced to terms of servitude for the first 2 to 3 decades of their lives. Such a system of indenture protected white communities from having to provide for the bastard children of free women. Still, punishments were not uniform, and it is likely that some, or perhaps many, liaisons between white women and black men went unrecorded, especially those that produced no offspring or involved white women above the servant classes, whose labor was not coveted by anyone other than their own kinfolk. Pronouncements of social disapproval were by no means a uniform response to these liaisons, and where such disdain was documented, the meaning is not always straightforward. In Virginia in 1681, a white woman named Mary Williamson was convicted of the filthy sin of fornication with a William, a Negro, and fined 500 pounds of tobacco. Was fornication with a Negro filthy, or was fornication alone worthy of that description? William, who had also committed fornication, but had also very arrogantly behaved himself, suffered 30 lashes. Were the lashes administered for fornication alone, for fornication with a white woman, for disrespectful behavior, or for some combination of those offenses? Other kinds of records occasionally hint at sentiments such as Thomas Plummer's petition in the mid-1690s protesting a fine. This white man admitted that he had one daughter who, unfortunately, having too much familiarity and commerce with a certain Negro man, was supposed by him to have a child, for which she is truly sorry. I'm so sorry my daughter had a baby by a Negro man. That's hilarious. That's hilarious. Most records, however, are entirely lacking in opinion beyond the fact of legal infraction, such as the 1619 entry under breaches of law for the grand jury of Henrico County, Virginia, which stated only that Major Chamberlain's woman servant Bridget, by name for bearing a child by a Negro, or a court summons dating from the 1690s for a married white woman named Mary Oliver for having committed adultery with a Negro, or the notation of a sale in the late 1690s describing a master who sold a Negro manslave, a white woman, and a mulatto child, the last of whom would be a servant, until it should arrive at the age of 31 years. At 31 years. Okay, so basically what Martha Hodes is writing here is that we know for a fact that there were a lot of, sexual relationships between white women and black men because of all the mulatto, and I hate that word, who were protesting for their freedom. We know that there were a lot of instances of white women, married, unmarried, servants, free, whatever, who were having sex with black men in the 17th century, in the 1600s, because of all the, biracial children that they produced, who were then protesting for their freedom, because the law said later, if you were born from a free woman, you could have your freedom. So all these black people who were born from, white women were saying, hey, I'm free. My daddy smashed my mama back in 1680, and now I'm here. So let me be free. So there were a lot of that. And there's a lot of white guys who went to court saying, oh, my daughter had a baby with a black man. I'm so sorry. And some married men who accused their, wives of adultery because they had black children, right? So yeah, this was happening a lot. It's what Martha Hodes is writing about. All right. So These chronicles of marriage, fornication, bastardy, servitude, fines, and court-ordered whippings attest to the absence of inevitably harsh legal consequences for Black men who consorted with white women in the colonial Chesapeake, as well as the absence of deadly extra-legal violence directed at the men alone. In fact, it was not uncommon for the Black fathers of white women's illegitimate children to remain unnamed. Apparently, the authorities did not make a special effort to identify a Black man if he was not mentioned or known from the start. Of course, there is no way to know for sure what came to pass in a particular community in consequence of an individual liaison, but it is certain that any severe legal consequences would show up in court records, and that if white people continuously engaged in extreme violence, at least glimmers of those actions would appear in the documents. Indeed, third and finally, these annals of liaisons between white women and Black men do not mention rape on any regular basis, either through the voices of the white women or through those of local authorities. Accusations against Black men for the rape of white women were not unknown in the 17th and 18th century Chesapeake, and Black men were more likely than white men to be convicted and sentenced to death for the rape of a white woman. Yet that important information does not tell the whole story. An incident from Tidewater, Virginia in 1681, for example, indicates that swifter prosecutions and harsher convictions for Black men could coexist with doubt about a Black man's guilt. When Catherine Watkins, the white wife of a slave owner, accused a Black man of raping her, some of Catherine's white neighbors returned an accusation of her adulterous behavior with several Black men, demonstrating that judgments upon a transgressing white woman, even one outside the servant classes, might override white suspicions about Black male sexuality. One white witness recounted that when a Black man named Dirk walked by Catherine, she took up the tail of his shirt, saying, "Dirk, thou wilt have a good long thing." Oh God. Oh God. Oh shit. No, I did not read that. One white witness recounted that when a Black man named Dirk walked by Catherine, the white woman who said a Black man raped her, and all her white neighbors said, no, you've been fucking with the brothers. She said she took up the tail of his shirt, saying, "Dirk, thou wilt have a good long thing." She said, "Damn, Dirk, I know you got a big dick." She said, "Damn, Dirk, give me that big old dick. Give me that dick, nigga." That's hilarious. That's crazy. I'm sorry. That was a wild sentence. "Dirk, thou wilt have a good long thing." That is insane. That is a wild Shakespearean sentence. I'm sorry. I have to continue. I'm sorry, Ozzy. I'm sorry. Ozzy says, "Damn, they snitched on her." They did snitch on her. They said, "Don't you..." They say, "Don't be lying on that, brother. You know you've been jumping up and down on soul polls. Stop it." Anyway, I'm sorry. "Dirk, thou wilt have a good long thing." That is the quote for the day, the quote of the day. Anyway, so another described the same scene, quoting Catherine's words as "a good prick." Oh, it gets worse. They say Catherine said, "You have a good prick." Wow. Catherine, the first witness, said also flirted with another Black man named Jack, claiming that she put her hands on his codpiece, at which he smiled. Oh, they snitching for real. They say Catherine out here grabbing dick. Dog, it's crazy. In the history books, you recorded as a hoe. In the history books, they got Catherine Watkins recording as a big dick grabbing hoe. I'm sorry. That's crazy. She grabbed a Black man's codpiece and smiled. Later, the witness continued, Catherine took Mingo about the neck, flung him on the bed, kissed him, and put her hand into his codpiece. Wow. In addition, more than one white person testified that Catherine had been drinking and that she had confessed her love for mulatto Jack. On the other side, someone had seen Catherine's mouth torn and her lips swelled. Along with the bloody handkerchief, she said the alleged rapist had stuffed into her mouth. Oh, she freaky. Nah, she freaky. She like to get gagged. She like it rough. She like it rough. So So yeah, basically the alleged rapist had stuffed into her mouth the bloody handkerchief. This witness said she had heard the accused confess to asking for Catherine's forgiveness and that Catherine's husband bid him keep off his plantation or else he would shoot him. Thus did some white neighbors doubt and blame a white woman with a bad reputation, and the woman's own husband let the man off with only a warning. No verdict was recorded in the Watkins case, but other record documents consequences far short of either lynching or court-ordered death for black men accused of raping white women. On the eastern shore of Maryland around 1699, a slave named Peter was sentenced to 39 lashes for raping the white Hannah Johnson. The following year, on the western shore, when a white widow named Mary Harris accused a slave named Sampson of raping her, both parties were held in the custody of the sheriff in order to ensure their appearance in court. Sampson was then acquitted. I have to say this: the Catherine Watkins story is unheard of in like my understanding of American history, in the sense that if a white woman just accused a black man of rape, Mulatto Jack would have died, right? And the other guys who were accused of raping white women, they got lashes and whippings, right? But Catherine obviously was such a hoe that the black guys got off after the accusation of rape. Imagine that in Rosewood. Imagine that in Rosewood. People come out and say, Patty, we know you a hoe. Stop playing. Stop playing. And Rosewood would have never happened. Black Wall Street would have never happened if these people were just honest that, you know, Becky was a hoe. You get what I'm saying? But this is still crazy. This is interesting history. This is very interesting history. I'm sorry. Anyway, racial discrimination can certainly be discerned in early American rape cases involving black men and white women, especially as the 17th century gave way to the 18th. In Virginia in 1701, a slave named Daniel was found guilty of raping a white woman and sentenced to death by hanging. The court ordered Daniel decapitated and his head displayed to deter Negroes and other slaves from committing the like crimes and offenses. While the phrase Negroes and other slaves here attests to the absence of an exclusive connection between black men and rape, various colonial laws did spell out both castration and the death penalty for black men convicted of sex crimes against white women. Whereas white men were seldom or never sentenced to castration for any crime, castration and death were stipulated for black men as the consequences of non-sexual crimes as well, including murder and arson. And some legal documents contain not only the words Negroes and other slaves, but also specify other non-white men, such as Indians. Going to the comments here, Ozzy says, I guess that proves Martha's point. The punishments were more severe after slavery ended. Essentially, right? Because imagine, like, you know, all those black men who got lynched, who, you know, for supposed sexual crimes. What if they just took off the belt and just whooped them, right? Imagine a bunch of white men with their belts off. Bunch of white men just running around with their belts off, just whooping on black men. Stop raping our women. I know thou'lt have a good thing. I know thou'lt have a good thing, but stop raping our women. Imagine if that happened. But no, that didn't happen. And yeah, Ozzy, like you said, yeah, it was much harsher after the end of slavery, apparently. Anyway. So evidence beyond legal codes also illuminates the fact that whites did not live in fear that black men would inevitably rape white women. In 1739, for example, whites claimed to have uncovered a conspiracy among slaves on Maryland's western shore in which black men were supposedly about to massacre all whites except for the young women, whom they intended to keep for their wives. When a female slave informed her mistress of the plot, the white women dismissed the news. The lawyer who recorded the events commented of the mistress, foolish woman, perhaps she had a mind for a black husband. You can't make this up, man. You can't make this up, man. This is hilarious. They said, girl, the niggas ain't gonna kill all the white folks and keep all the white women. You crazy. You must want a black husband. Is your name Martha Hodes? Anyway, this white woman was not convulsed with fears of rape over this incident. And although the white man may have taken the threat more seriously, he also thought it perfectly possible for a white woman to desire a black man. Furthermore, judgments about the depravity of white women who, like Catherine Watkins, might fraternize with black men can also be discerned. In a defamation case that took place in 1694 in Tidewater, Virginia, one married couple accused another of slander, asserting that the accused wife had told stories about incest, abortion, and adultery, as well as the fact that Mrs. Hyde was such a whore that she would lie with a Negro. Okay, this is getting wild. This is getting wild. We're only 39 pages in this wild book. We're only 39 pages in this wild book. And people are divorcing each other saying that my wife is so wild, she would sleep with a Negro. This is insane. Anyway, all of these factors, the blurred lines of servitude and slavery, the ongoing fact of other liaisons between white women and black men, and the absence of uniform and inevitable violent white anxiety about black male sexuality help to account for the restraint on the part of the white neighbors of Nell and Charles. Yet at the very same time, although the marriage of Nell and Charles provoked no violence, elite whites were not wholly untroubled by it. Their vexation is apparent in the facts that everyone talked so much about the wedding and that Nell and Charles were condemned in gossip. The words often heard were repeated numerous times in the 18th century testimony. Samuel Love said that as a boy, he had often heard grown-ups say that a Negro manslave was married to Eleanor Butler, and often heard that they went as man and wife. Gene Howard often heard that Nell and Charles had slave children. And Benjamin Jameson heard his mother say that she heard many people say that Lord Baltimore had cautioned Nell against the marriage. Joseph Jameson recalled a scene in which Mrs. Doyne called on his father when Negro Charles had been there on an errand. Joseph's mother said to Mrs. Doyne, there was Major Boardman's Charles, the husband of Eleanor Butler, whom Mrs. Doyne said she and Madam Withaw saw married. At which point, Mrs. Doyne launched into the story about Nell's encounter with Lord Baltimore. And of course, the story of Nell and Charles was passed down for nearly a century. There was reason for all that talk. Interesting. So, the problem of the marriage. For the elite white community on Maryland's lower western shore, the problem with the marriage of Nell and Butler Charles was less that Charles was a black man and that he was a slave. The marriage was a problem not so much because it transgressed boundaries of race, but because it confused issues of freedom, slavery, and labor. Neighbors were concerned not so much because a white woman and a black man were sexual partners, but because the mixture of European and African ancestry blurred the boundaries of freedom and bondage in a society that was beginning to take its labor system on racial slavery. That was beginning to stake its labor system on racial slavery. In the late 17th century, when whites were beginning to associate African ancestry and slavery exclusively with one another, sexual liaisons between Europeans and Africans would comprise the equations of blackness and slavery, whiteness and freedom. Such a liaison was, accordingly, more unsettling to the 18th century descendants than to the 17th century observers. These developments manifested themselves in the question of Nell's legal status as slave or free. Although Lord Baltimore wondered why Nell wanted to go to bed with Charles, he did not abuse her with a tirade about mixing European and African blood. Rather, Lord Baltimore chided Nell principally for the fact that by marrying a slave, she would be enslaving her posterity and herself. Nell's status as slave or free was in fact the crucial issue when her enslaved grandchildren petitioned for liberty on the basis of descent from a free woman. The problem of Nell's status upon her marriage to Charles and the ensuing freedom or bondage of their descendants stemmed from colonial laws about the inheritance of slavery. People were confused because Nell and Charles had married in 1681, the year in which Maryland lawmakers had rewritten the statutes about marriage and the inheritance of slavery. Laws intended to control sex between servants and slaves, between English and African residents, between whites and blacks were written to strengthen and maintain the developing system of racial slavery in the South. The early laws of Maryland, for example, indicate that slavery and freedom were not necessarily or absolutely correlated, respectively, with African and English identity. Lawmakers used the two closely related phrases, Negroes or other slaves, and Negroes and other slaves in their statutes. The distinct categories were slave labor and free labor, and the intention was to keep members of those two classes whose lives could be quite similar, separate for the sake of the masters. So basically what they're trying to say is like Nell and Charles's marriage, complicated the whole thing. Like they're up here trying to develop capitalism. They're up here trying to get rich. We're trying to figure out how we have this hierarchy in this new society, and Nell and Charles fuck it up by fucking. That's what they're essentially saying here. So, lawmakers in all southern colonies wrote statutes that discouraged marriage or sex between English and Africans, servants and slaves, whites and blacks from the late 17th century forward. Liaisons between white female servants and black male slaves amounted to enough of a problem that in 1664, the Assembly of Maryland passed a law to make it an undesirable choice for white women. Free women who married slaves would be enslaved for the lifetimes of their husbands, meaning that a white person could become a slave, and the children of such liaisons would be enslaved for life. For example, when Mary Peters, who was white, married a slave in about 1680, she became the slave of her husband's master. This was the law to which Lord Baltimore referred when he upbraided Nell on her impending marriage to Charles. When white Marylanders soon discovered, however, that such a law legally encouraged masters to force marriages between servant women and slave men in order to gain more slaves for themselves. This goes to show you how crazy racist, like, slavery and racism make no sense, because the law said, hey, we're going to make it harder for white women to marry black men. So we're going to tell white women, yo, if you marry a black man, you're going to be a slave and your kids are going to be slaves. So then the rich white guy said, well, shit, I can make my white female servants marry my black slaves and I can have, boom, even more slaves. It made, like, that's just, that shows you capitalism really doesn't care about racism. I guess the slave masters went woke. Is that the correlation of, like, slave masters going woke because they don't want to go broke, because they let their white female servants marry the black slaves, have sex, and have more children? That's crazy. Anyway, I'm continuing here. So, although when white Marylanders soon discovered, however, that such a law legally encouraged masters to force marriages between servant women and slave men in order to gain more slaves for themselves, the law was changed in 1681. Although their master, William Borman, did not force Nell and Charles to marry each other, he may well have been perfectly pleased with the arrangements and its economic benefits to him. The new law of 1681 stipulated that if a marriage between a slave man and a freeborn English or white woman who was a servant had been coerced or even simply permitted by the woman's master, the woman would be released from servitude and any children would be born into freedom. In fact, Lord Baltimore apparently had the law of 1664 changed specifically for the sake of Nell Butler, whose marriage to Charles was permitted, if not encouraged, by her master. Although this would seem to speak for Nell's ultimate freedom, and therefore for the freedom of her petitioning grandchildren, there was a problem of chronology. The marriage took place in August and the law passed in September. If Lord Baltimore had pressed the change for Nell's sake, his actions may have come too late. So that's crazy. All right. So Nell is a white woman who is a servant, kind of slave, to this rich white man named Lord Baltimore. And Lord Baltimore likes, Nell so much, he asked to marry her. Nell says, no, I would rather lay with Negro Charles than sleep with you, Lord Baltimore. So Lord Baltimore, being the ultimate cuck, basically gets the law changed, for the girl he really likes to marry. I don't know if that's romantic and sweet or cuck behavior. I don't know. Like, the girl you really like marries somebody else, so you change the law to make it actually happen for her and for her children to be free. I don't know if that's a nice guy or like, like, I don't know what I would do if I was in this. I might be a dick and be like, nah, we're going to make this law even harsher. I'm sorry. I'm continuing here. Anyway. Lawmakers also wrote statutes stipulating how the condition of slavery was to be inherited. Colonial inheritance laws, in contrast to English laws of patrilineal descent, were laws of partis sequitur ventrum. Literally, progeny follows the womb. A child's legal status followed the condition of the mother, not the father, as slave or free. Freedom suits from the late 17th century forward attest to the power of this law. Partis sequitur ventrum meant that children of an enslaved black woman would be slaves even if the father had been free. Keeping the children born of black women and white men in slavery worked to the advantage of masters in a number of ways. Masters could acquire more slaves through sexual exploitation. Slaveholders could keep knowledge of this exploitation to a minimum in their own communities by keeping the offspring within the slave household. and the children as slaves could be raised by their mothers. Why colonial lawmakers did not write laws to enslave the children of any slave parent, whether the mother or the father, is open to speculation. Perhaps the most compelling reasons are the question of who would care for the enslaved children of a free white woman, the fact that paternity was too difficult or impossible to prove, and the fact that such a law might encourage masters to coerce white women into sex with enslaved men in order to produce more slaves. Or perhaps such laws would have left too little distinction between white women and black women if either one could produce enslaved offspring. I don't even want to think about that too deeply because we're talking about like making women give birth to children just for the sake of capitalism. Oh wait, we're talking about that now with the birth rate issue all across the world. I mean, the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? Everybody across the world is so upset their country's birth rate is declining if you're so lucky to live in a developed first world nation. And we're saying, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? How can we encourage our women to get pregnant and birth more children to keep our status quo alive? I mean, it's essentially the same thing. And I don't even want to think about it. Brian C says, are your Afro-pessimism live streams finished? Actually, yes. That's a good question, Brian C. I finished the entire book of Afro-pessimism, which is one of the best books I've read last year. So I encourage you to read the book yourself or watch the live streams, whatever you want to do. And shout out to Brian C. That's a very, very good question. Shout out to Brian C. Going on, continuing here. So, as the fundamental labor system of the South changed from white servitude to black slavery, the separation of Europeans and Africans became crucial to whites in order to sustain the institution of racial slavery. Once the law stipulated that a child's status as slave or free followed its mother, liaisons between white women and black men would render the equation of African ancestry and slavery ineffective, because such unions would produce free children of partial African ancestry. Hence, the enactment of laws that discouraged white women from choosing black partners. These transitions in labor and law helped to explain the misgivings over the marriage of Nell and Charles in the late 17th century. The children of this union would erode the categories of slavery and freedom based on African and English or black and white identity. With their marriage, the protagonists highlighted the potential for this erosion, causing unease at least among elite whites. Then, by their quest for freedom, the grandchildren of partial African ancestry brought the crisis beyond the local community into the courts and the public record. That such a crisis did not arise when Nell and Charles were alive may be accounted for in part by the fact that their children had been legally enslaved in the late 17th century, thereby protecting the white community from having to provide for the offspring of a servant and a slave. Such children would become much more problematic for white Southerners as the 19th century unfolded. Very interesting information. So Brian C. said, I've already read it. Well, shout out to Brian C. Tell us what you thought about the book. What did you think about Afro-pessimism? I'll give a brief, like 2-sentence summary. I believe that Afro-pessimism gives a solid analysis of the state of blackness in our modern world, right? Blackness is the phobogenic object of all who are non-black and many who are black, meaning that just the thought of blackness makes people afraid and full of disgust and rage. And the idea is to permanently try to destroy blackness, or the idea is to permanently destroy blackness in the minds of people who are non-black is a way to affirm their own humanity. I believe in that. I do believe also that within that, you have to have some sort of hope for a better future. I'm a Afro-optimist or Afro-realist and not an Afro-pessimist, in the sense that I believe we have to remember that we are the original humans. And while humans today, bash blackness as a way to affirm their own humanity, we have to remember that we were basically all over this planet for most of human history, and all the people who now fall under this social category of non-black are latecomers to humanity. We have to keep our humanity, is my assessment of Afro-pessimism. But what do you think about it? Skeletor Likes Potatoes says they don't have any secret desire for that. I don't know exactly what you mean by that. Skeletor Likes Potatoes. Brian C says plan to read this one eventually. I don't know exactly what y'all are talking about, but Skeletor, you have to explain that. Anyway, continuing here. So The language of late 17th and early 18th century statutes also betrays the anxiety of white lawmakers. It is difficult to disentangle the importance of keeping servants and slaves separated from the importance of keeping Europeans and Africans and Christians and non Christians apart. The anxiety laden language, moreover, contained distinct references to gender and sexuality. With regard to marriage, for example, the Maryland Law of 1664 described freeborn English women forgetful of their free condition, who, to the disgrace of our nation, do intermarry with Negro slaves. The same law also spoke of sanctions for deterring such freeborn women from such shameful matches. Of course, the phrases freeborn English women and Negro slaves makes it difficult to pinpoint whether the disgrace stemmed from white women marrying black men, from freeborn women marrying enslaved men, or from a combination of the two. Maryland's law of 1681 referred to freeborn English or white women who married Negroes and slaves as acting always to the satisfaction of their lascivious, 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 that's the word, lascivious and lustful desires, and to the disgrace not only of the English but also of many other Christian nations. A 1692 law a 1692 law, a 1692 law included the same words about satisfying lascivious and lustful desires and disgracing English and Christian nations. And a law passed in 1715 referred to such sexual relations as unnatural and inordinate copulations. Although this language points to judgments upon the white or freeborn or English or Christian woman in a liaison with a black or enslaved or African or non-Christian man, the intent was largely to make those white women inaccessible to black men. The purpose of this injunction was, in part, to bar black men from the social, economic, and political rights of white men as racial slavery became the entrenched labor system of the South. Very interesting stuff here. Going now to the comments. Brian C. says, to be honest, Afro-pessimism was one of the most depressing political analyses I've ever read. I agree and disagree with you, Brian C. I think we have to remember, Brian C., and I don't know you from a can of paint, but I'll say this. Frank B. Wilderson lives a very unique life as a black man. I mean, Frank B. Wilderson in his book wrote that he grew up in a neighborhood where the next guy over was a sitting senator who ran for president. People in his neighborhood traveled around in golf carts. There is an extreme class difference between Frank B. Wilderson's book and the average black lives. I grew up generally middle class in the deep south of Louisiana, and my life and Frank B. Wilderson's lives are as different as probably your life and the son of Donald Trump. Right? Like Frank B. Wilderson has a very unique experience. And I think, we need to take his analysis seriously, but also with a grain of salt. Right? So that's what I got to say. So was Nell a slave? Nell and Charles had married before the new law about inheriting slavery through the mother took effect in 1681, but their children had been born after its enactment. Yet, in accordance with the earlier law, all their children had been enslaved from birth. The 18th century witnesses had varying memories as to the names, ages, and living quarters of the progeny of Nell and Charles, but their collective memory clearly spelled slavery as the descendants' lot. Thomas Bowling, for example, said he always understood the descendants of the said Irish Nell were held in slavery. All right, so that Ozzy, that answers your question about, was Nell Irish? I guess she was called Irish Nell. So always understood the descendants of the said Irish Nell were held in slavery. John Banson, who had worked for William Borman, remembered a fellow laborer as a mulatto man who was a son of a white woman called Irish Nell, but was a slave, occasioned by his mother intermarrying with a slave. In Edward Edelon's version of the visit from Lord Baltimore, the gentleman had reprimanded Nell with the words, "What a pity, so likely a young girl as you are should fling herself away as to marry a Negro. For he warned her, you'll make slaves of your children and their posterity." Thomas Bowling also told the story of a gentleman, whether it was Lord Baltimore or any other person, who told Nell that by marrying Charles, she would enslave her children, but that if she married a white man, her children might be of a credit in the world. Going now to the comments, Brian C says, I grew up middle class as well. I think Afro pessimism is depressing because it's true. I agree with you, Brian C. A lot of Afro pessimism is true. We as Black folks are essentially on our own. All other groups of people, whatever their racial categorization, if they are non Black, they have a deep seated hatred of even being associated with us or even being classified near to us. And the goal of all other groups of people is to get as close to whiteness as possible. And the ritualized random violence against Black people, physically and psychologically and socially, is a part of all society's function. I agree with that assessment of Afro pessimism. I just think we have to remember as Black folks, we want an end to this world. And in Afro pessimism, Frank B. Wilderson quotes, Fanon, Frantz Fanon, as saying that the only way to get out of this never-ending cycle of ritualistic violence against Black people is to bring about the end of the world, which is what we want, because there was a world before our experience as Black people, and there can be a world after. But we have to usher in an end to this world as we know it. And that's what makes me an Afro optimist and also a revolutionary, I would say. Okay, but let me know what you think about that. Continuing here. So, in order to determine whether the petitioning grandchildren of Nell and Charles should be freed, the court had to decide whether Nell, their maternal ancestor, had herself been a slave. If Nell had in fact remained free despite marrying a slave, then her descendants should be granted their freedom. But the 18th century witnesses disagreed as to whether Nell had been enslaved on marrying Charles. Some were sure that she had remained free. Anne Whitehorn, a woman near the age of one of Nell's daughters, they were girls together and lived within 2 miles of each other, and who knew Nell until she died, told the court that she never knew or heard that the said Eleanor Butler was in a state of slavery, that she frequently used to come and see her children and stay with them for a month or longer at a time, as other free people do. William McPherson said he never knew of the said Nell being held as a slave. As he remembered it, Nell acted as a free woman. Though Nell lived among slaves and labored in the fields, most remembered that she was not confined to the Boorman plantation. Over the years, when Charles was hired out or passed on to other members of the Boorman family, Nell often went with him. To those who spoke of slavery as Nell's lot, talked in abstract terms only. Benjamin Jameson, for example, recounted that a county magistrate had remarked that Nell and Charles were married under a law that made them slaves, and Samuel Abel had heard that Nell became a slave by a law of this province, whereby white women marrying of slaves should become slaves to the house of their husband's master. A number of witnesses also recalled Lord Baltimore's warning to Nell that by marrying Charles, she would enslave herself and her children. William Simpson remembered his father telling someone that Nell was a foolish woman for marrying Charles because it would make herself and her children slaves forever after. Benjamin Jameson remembered Baltimore telling Nell that if she married Negro Charles, she would enslave herself and all of her posterity. Brian C says Frantz Fanon was so based. Frantz Fanon is like, I'm reading this other book now. I'm not reading this book on stream, but I'm reading this book right now. It's titled Existence in Black, an anthology of Black existential philosophy, edited by Lewis R. Gordon. This is a book that I got from Amazon a few weeks ago. I suggest everybody pick this up because it's hella dope. I'm reading this like on the train. I'm like, on what page am I on? Like page 70 right now in this book. Very dope book. Frantz Fanon is quoted by everybody here. And I feel so bad, like as a person who wants to be a Black intellectual, that I have not read Fanon. I've read around Fanon. And I feel so bad. I feel so bad that everybody here says Fanon is so based, like you say, Brian C. And everybody loves and adores Fanon. And I had the chance to read him when I was 16, 17, 20. Hell, every single day of my life, I had a chance to read Fanon, and I haven't. I've heard of The Wretched of the Earth since I was like 15, and I have not picked it up, and I'm very sad. But I suggest everybody also pick up this book, too, that I'm reading right now, and check that out. So Existence in Black by Lewis R. Gordon. Existence in Black. Very dope book. Anyway, continuing here. In the face of contradictory testimony, the inventory of Major William Boorman's goods and chattels taken after his death in 1709 offers a clue to Nell's legal status. At his death, Boorman owned one elderly Negro man named Charles. Below Charles were listed one old Negro man named Robert and six named and unnamed mulatto slaves, two women, two girls, and two children of unspecified gender. Some of these were surely the children of Nell and Charles. The final items on the list was one old Irish woman. Inventories were lists of saleable items. If Nell were not a slave, neither was she a free servant woman. Slaves and indentured servants were listed in inventories. Non-indentured servants were not, because they were not part of the master's property. At the very least, then, Nell was an indentured servant as long as Charles was alive. But Borman's will offers a more definitive clue, one that the 18th century court did not find. Borman left three slaves to his wife with these words: I give and bequeath unto my dear and loving wife, Mary Borman, three slaves, namely Rapt, Charles, and Eleanor. It is clear from this inventory and will that Eleanor Butler, a white woman, was legally a slave of the Borman family. The Bormans no doubt allowed Nell a certain freedom of movement on and off their plantation, perhaps out of deference to Lord Baltimore, who had not wished to see Nell enslaved. But Nell's freedom of movement also suggests the possibility that although whites acknowledged Nell's legal status as a slave, they were unable to treat her fully as a slave, as the institution of racial slavery became more entrenched toward the end of the 17th century. There is also the possibility that English people thought of Nell less as a white woman than as an Irish woman, with the Irish in Nell's name parallel to the Negro in Charles's, making it a racial designation rather than a national or an ethnic one. I mean, we all know back in the day, white folks used to get really hung up about the Irish. Going out to the comments. Brian C. said, I read half of The Wretched of the Earth. It's a very profound book, what I've heard. It's a earth-shattering book, and it's a book that I wish I read. Let us know what you think about, Fanon's work. Is it Afro-pessimist? Is it Afro-optimist? Is it revolutionary? Is it reactionary? Let us know what you think of Fanon's work. Continuing here. So, in spite of parallels in the lives of servants and slaves in the colonial Chesapeake, servitude and slavery were legally distinct categories in ways that would have mattered to Nell Butler. Although although lawmakers often wrote statutes that applied to indentured servants and slaves alike, witness such titles as An Act Concerning Servants and Slaves. Indentured servants were legally persons with the ability to petition in court, a right denied slaves. Further, at the end of their terms of indenture, these servants assumed all the rights of free English people. When Nell came to the Chesapeake with Lord Baltimore, she was his indentured servant, and had she not married Charles, her term of servitude would have expired 4 or 5 years later. Lord Baltimore probably expressed surprise at Nell's desire to marry Charles, because had Nell wished to marry a white man, she would not have had any trouble finding one. Recall the surplus of white men and shortage of white women in the Chesapeake colonies. Furthermore, the white men eligible to Nell could have offered her decent prospects, as the lower western shore of Maryland in the 17th century provided fair opportunities for white men who had finished their terms of servitude. If white men traveled overseas in hopes of attaining freeholder status, white women often made the passage in hopes of marrying a man with land. Promotional literature even promised women marriage to wealthy planters. True, opportunities declined for those whose terms ended after about 1680, but Nell could still have found a white husband among the as yet unmarried men who had arrived earlier, or could have married a white man who, though not particularly prosperous, would not have caused her any notoriety either. This was why white neighbors talked. They could not imagine why Nell had chosen to marry Charles. The witnesses' accounts of the encounter between Nell and Lord Baltimore is one of the few places in which Nell's voice comes through in the testimony, though undoubtedly transformed by the visions of the storyteller. According to Thomas Bowling, when Lord Baltimore reprimanded Nell, she insisted that the marriage was her choice and that she would rather have Charles than Lord Baltimore himself. In Benjamin Jameson's version, Baltimore asked her how she would like to go to bed to a Negro, and she answered him that she would rather go to bed with Negro Charles than his lordship. Just as evidence militates against a forced match, it also militates against pregnancy as the cause of the marriage. Samuel Love, for example, testified that he had never heard of Nell giving birth to any bastard children. The descendants of those neighbors wove a narrative of Nell and Charles that could probably be called a love story. In Samuel Abel P's words, they said the said woman called Butler fell in love with Charles and wanted to marry him. Still, the motivations and emotions of the protagonists remain most elusive in the face of the consequences. Nell Butler and Charles got caught in a rift in time. They were permitted to marry in what seems to have been a lovely wedding with the good wishes of their well-to-do white neighbors. Yet at the same time, gossip circulated Nell was legally enslaved, and the children and grandchildren of Nell and Charles were enslaved from birth and treated as slaves. Not unlike later liaisons between white women and black men, the one between Nell and Charles provoked anxiety on the parts of white people, but did not threaten the foundations of their society. The court at first agreed that because the children of Nell and Charles had been born after 1681, they should have been free, and therefore that the petitioning grandchildren should be released from slavery. But their master, a grandson of William Borman, appealed the decision and won on the grounds that Nell had in fact been a slave. Thus had her progeny inherited the condition of slavery, and thus would her grandchildren remain enslaved. In 1787, however, the General Court of the Western Shore heard a petition for freedom presented by a great granddaughter of Nell and Charles, and this time the petitioner won. Here, the court ruled that in order to prove that Nell had been a slave, it would also have to be proven that she had been enslaved after marrying Charles. Without a record of such a sentence, the court reasoned, Nell could not legally have been held in slavery, and neither could her descendants. Because the county records had been destroyed in a fire, the court accepted hearsay evidence on the question. The evidence, the testimony of the 16 witnesses in the 1760s, convinced the court that Nell had never been a slave. Not even the verdict of re-enslavement in the previous case swayed the court in the late 1780s. The master of Nell's newly freed great-granddaughter appealed, but freedom was affirmed. Very, very interesting. Very interesting stuff here. So yeah, basically, Nell became a slave because she married the black guy, Charles, and they were only able to get married at that very specific time in history. And then their children, sort of like tried to fight for freedom. But the son of the master who owned the white woman who married the black slave said, nope, their mother was enslaved legally, so they can't be free. But then years later, they let them go. The great-grandchildren get free because they say Nell couldn't have possibly been a slave because she's a white woman, essentially. That's essentially what they say. Like, they're trying to coax it up in legalese, but essentially they got free because they can't say white women can be slaves, right? That opens up a new can of worms. So, in fact, the two Butler cases together made an impression on other slaves, and many sought to claim descent from Eleanor Butler in an effort to gain their liberty. Shortly after the first case, for example, an artisan slave on the lower Western Shore by the name of Stephen Butler ran away, claiming his status as a relational of the original plaintiffs. Almost 20 years later, a Virginia slave owner offered a reward for a runaway named Jim, who may pretend to be of the Butler family, who have lately obtained their freedom in the general court. In 1798, a Maryland newspaper notice described a mulatto named Ralph who ran away under the pretense of going to the general court in order to procure his freedom as one of the descendants of Nell Butler. Another notice said of mother and son runaways. It is supposed that they will make for Annapolis as they pretend to be descendants of the famous Nell Butler. Ironically, then, although white people were apparently unable to envision Nell as a slave, the court decision helped to free enslaved people of partial African ancestry. Very interesting. So basically, Nell was vicariously, accidentally a white ally because by marrying Charles and having children, she sort of gave number one, her descendants freedom. But secondly, she encouraged all these other black people to like run away from slavery because they're going to say, hey, I'm light-skinned enough to say I'm descended from Nell Butler. Maybe I can trick these white folks into letting me be free. But they had to take that risk and run off the plantation. So that's actually kind of a good thing. So Nell Butler, the white Irish woman who married the black man in 1681, kind of an ally. I don't know. Anyway, continuing here. It is difficult to determine the motives that contributed to the verdicts of Maryland courts in the 18th century. The 1760s testimony, which played an important role in both cases, had been shaped by the world around those who were asked to narrate the story of Nell and Charles. In 1767, the year witnesses were first asked to recall the fateful marriage. It had been 86 years since the wedding, and the eldest witness was 85 years old. The recollections ranged from direct to quite indirect. Joseph Jameson, for example, had lived within a mile of and knew Irish Nell very well, whereas Benjamin Jameson's information came from his late mother, who had gotten her information from a number of elderly women, all of whom had since died. His testimony began this way. He has heard his mother, who is now dead, say that she has heard old Madam Witham, who is also dead, say, as one historian has noted, people construct memories in response to changing circumstances, and therefore the important question is not how accurately a recollection fitted some piece of a past reality, but why historical actors constructed their memories in a particular way at a particular time. The late 18th century white witnesses and judges who pondered the enslavement of Nell Butler were probably not entirely unfamiliar with liaisons between white women and black men either. In 1769, for example, when the white Mary Skinner deserted her white husband to live with a slave who was the father of her child, her husband published a notice in the Maryland Gazette proclaiming this fact. What a embarrassing. White men been getting embarrassed. White men been getting embarrassed. Freedom suits also continued to reveal such liaisons. Also in 1769, the enslaved Frances Peck won her freedom by demonstrating to the court that her mother, Mary Peck, was white. And in 1784, the enslaved Anne Ginn won her freedom when she convinced the court that she was born of a free, white, married woman. Wow. These are all, once again, we know that there were a lot of white women having sex with black men because a lot of basically half black, half white people were saying, I'm free because my mama laid down with Negro Charles, essentially. So there is also evidence of white dismay at liaisons across the color line in the second half of the 18th century. Although white women and black men were not necessarily targeted over white men and black women. One white Virginian observed in 1757, for example, that the country swarms with mulatto bastards. What I have to read that again. One white Virginian observed in 1757, for example, that the country swarms with mulatto bastards. Did he visit the Bay Area of California? Each one of whom was the descendant of a black father or mother, and who would then go on to marry another white person. Furthermore, a black man convicted of the rape of a white woman in the late 18th century could subsequently be treated with a modicum of justice. In 1770, after a slave named Abraham was sentenced to death for theft and rape, his master and both of his alleged victims successfully petitioned the governor for Abraham's pardon on the grounds that his confession had been extracted during a whipping. The rape victim, a white woman named Eleanor Bryan, also explained, perhaps she was coerced by the man's master, perhaps not, that she could not swear to the identity of her attacker. On one side, the Maryland judges may have been concerned about the property rights of slave masters. On the other, they may have been influenced by revolutionary ideology about freedom. Yet as racial slavery took hold, 18th century whites may well have been less familiar with the blurring of servitude and slavery than their 17th century counterparts had been. Although white neighbors may have thought of Nell more as Irish Nell in her own lifetime, it seems that their 18th century descendants thought of Nell more as a white woman. By the second half of the 18th century, when the descendants tried to resolve the dilemma of Nell's status as slave or free, they were largely unable to imagine a white person as a slave. That the ideology of the American Revolution ultimately equated freedom with whiteness worked in favor of Nell's descendants. The idea of Nell as a free woman swayed 3 of the 4 courts that heard the case in the 18th century. The one court that pronounced Nell to have been a slave centered its arguments on property rights. In the story of Nell and Charles, as in the chronicles that follow, the children of a white woman and a black man precipitated a local crisis. In this case, it was the offspring of a white woman and a black man, the enslaved grandchildren and great grandchildren who petitioned for freedom, that forced the liaison into court and therefore into the world beyond one small Southern community. As people of mixed European and African ancestry, the descendants of Nell Butler and Charles defied not only racial categories, but also the hardening categories of slavery and freedom. The petitioning descendants were people of partial African ancestry who claimed the right to freedom. As in the 19th century stories to come, once the case was in court, testimony made clear that the liaison had not been a secret. And here, as in the cases that follow, white toleration for sex between white women and black men also served, paradoxically, to expose imperfections in the systems of racial slavery, in the evidence of free children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of partial African ancestry. In this case, the freed descendants of Irish Nell and Negro Charles. Very interesting stuff. Brief water break. And we continue. By the close of the 17th century, the transition from servitude to slavery was complete, and slavery rested upon racial foundations. As free people of African ancestry, the children of white women and black men would comprise the institution of racial slavery, and therefore sex between white women and black men posed a threat to Southern whites. And yet, in the face of such a threat, local whites could still tolerate now illicit liaisons between white women and black men. If this toleration resulted from the desire to avoid confronting the fallibilities of both racial slavery and patriarchy, the effect could be, where children were involved, to magnify those fallibilities. White people did not react violently to the marriage of a white woman and a black man in the 17th century Chesapeake, where such liaisons formed along with settlements. But in the late 18th century, in one of the Butler freedom cases, the Maryland court opined the assembly considered white women who so debased themselves as to marry Negroes to be no better than Negroes, and indeed they deserve less favor. Those sentiments lead perfectly into the story of Polly Lane and Jim in antebellum North Carolina, in which white people upheld the value of a slave man over the claims of a white woman who had, they discovered, chosen the black man as her sexual partner. In the antebellum narratives that follow, liaisons between white women and black men proceed without the legal sanction of marriage, but they continue to proceed with a measure of toleration tempered by harsh judgment and ostracism, though not yet by inevitable white violence. And that's the end of chapter 2. Irish Nell and Charles Butler, Negro Charles, however you want to put them, right? And yeah, that was a very interesting story. We're going to read chapter 3, Bastardy, Polly Lane, and Jim in our next live stream. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, once again, I have to make this clear. I don't know exactly if this is true, but I've heard this, and you can research this yourself. I believe Barack Obama is descended from Nell and Charles through his mother's side, because Nell and Charles's children got free. Nell Butler, Irish Nell and Charles had a bunch of kids, 3 or 4. They got free eventually, and they eventually married into white society. So look this up yourself. Go look up Irish Nell and Negro Charles. Your Google search bar will thank you later. You'll get wild recommendations after that. But look that up. Look up Irish Nell and Barack Obama, and you'll see. Okay, so yeah, that's all I got to say about that. Y'all be easy out there. Simon Hill keeps it trill. Booked React number 8, part 2, finished, complete. Peace. Have a good night.